Thank you for having me in this conference. Allow me to share my screen. Let's hope that this works. Okay. There we go. Can you see my screen in full size?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Great. So yeah, thank you for having me today. My presentation is, the objectives of my presentation is to really set the scene for the rest of the day. I've titled it Taming the Wild West because I believe it's quite appropriate given the stage that the crypto asset industry is in currently. And what I'd like to do really is allow us all to take a step back, think of the progress that's been made on the regulatory front, especially with regards to anti-money laundering and terrorist financing, regarding crypto assets, understand the progress that has been made and potentially share some insights on where I feel that we are going. So just very quickly, just the agenda. So I'll introduce myself as quickly as possible and move on to the meat of the presentation. I'd like to go through a timeline in terms of crypto asset regulation, particularly over the past few years, and really focus on on the developments that have been made at the Financial Action Task Force level, delving deeper into the 12-month reviews that the FATF has been undertaking on jurisdictions, and then talking through the latest updated guidance on virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. So just very quickly, who we are, XReg. So we are a boutique policy and regulatory affairs consultancy, and we specialize in crypto assets. We work with both the public sector and the private sector. On the public sector side, we work with a number of governments and regulatory authorities in order to assist them in developing policy regarding crypto assets and also implementing regulatory frameworks. And we also do a lot of capacity building and training, particularly with financial intelligence units and law enforcement agencies. And we also work with the private sector. So we do work with a number of crypto asset firms and we assist them with regulatory strategy and implementation. And we're also doing quite a bit of work with the wider financial industry, such as banks and other players that are looking to explore this sector. So this is me. I'm Nathan. I started my career as an accountant. And as you can imagine, accountants love ledgers. And when I discovered distributed ledgers, that's when I really grew a passion for this industry. And I wanted to make it my full-time career. So I kind of got lost in the crypto world and I moved into regulation. So Gibraltar, where I'm from, was one of the first jurisdictions to implement a regulatory framework for crypto asset related businesses. And I was lucky enough to work in the team at the regulator that were authorizing and then supervising a number of crypto asset companies in Gibraltar. So I know this is the fifth conference, so this is definitely going to be recap for most of you here, but it's always good to take a step back and really acknowledge these unique assets that we are exposed to. And I've highlighted two particular properties of these assets because I feel that they're even more important for law enforcement. And it's the pseudonymity or anonymity that are associated with crypto assets and virtual assets. That coupled with this cross-border nature of these assets do lead to some significant threats. We have this unique type of asset that is able to be transferred globally from one part of the world to the other at the press of a button without the ability to intercept these assets. So, I mean, I'll leave these properties on the slide for a second in case you want to recap, but I really wanted to focus really on these two key properties of these assets. So what's the big deal? When we take a step back and we think of these assets, these crypto assets that emerged seemingly out of nowhere, we had this unique type of asset which didn't quite fit into the traditional regulatory regimes, or at least the majority of global regulatory regimes. So we had these assets, they weren't really considered to be money, not considered to be e-money most of the time in most jurisdictions. Most jurisdictions as well did not consider these assets to be securities or financial instruments, although it can be debatable depending on what particular crypto asset you're looking at. But thinking of the more traditional crypto assets such as Bitcoin, for example, these tests were rarely or rarely met in most jurisdictions. And importantly, especially considering the majority of you guys are law enforcement and FIUs, it's that they were not in scope of AML regulations. So here's where we go back to this analogy of the Wild West. We had this new emerging asset class. It could be used globally by criminals with very little oversight from any regulatory authority. So what does this mean? It means that we have this asset that's extremely difficult to track and trace, little to no AML requirements anywhere, very easy to use by criminal organizations for money laundering. Most providers, even if they were genuine, they were acting as poor custodians due to the lack of regulation and lack of standards. So they became a very large target for criminal organizations. Many of the larger exchanges going back a few years were subject to hacks, and then those funds would be integrated back into society. So this was an issue. It was an issue that luckily the FATF picked up on relatively quickly. So enter the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, for the FATF. Again, just some recap, because I know you're all familiar with this, but the FATF are a global AML CFT standard setting body. Most jurisdictions participate in FATF either through a direct membership or through regional bodies, and they require, or by being members of FATF, the idea is that jurisdiction follow the standards. Even though the FATF set standards and they're called recommendations, the consequence of not complying with these recommendations could see you as a jurisdiction grey-listed or blacklisted. So one of the key milestones, and probably one of the more significant events that have occurred in the history of crypto regulation, happened in October 2018, where the FATF clarified that their standards should apply to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. So from that day onwards, there was a clear signal from the FATF that jurisdictions needed to build frameworks to allow for the regulation, at least from a money laundering, terrorist financing perspective, to allow for the regulation of what they call virtual asset service providers, which are businesses that are interacting with virtual assets. Both virtual asset and virtual asset service providers are defined terms in the guidance. So in June 19, they issued guidance, quite comprehensive guidance, explaining how jurisdictions were to implement these regulatory frameworks. And they also committed to undertaking 12-month reviews of this standard implementation, meaning that 12 months from the guidance, they conducted a review on the progress that jurisdictions were making in adopting these standards. As you can imagine, in a year, it's quite difficult to fully launch an AML CFT regime and regulate virtual asset service providers. So the progress made between jurisdictions varied quite significantly. The conclusion from that 12-month review was that they needed to conduct another 12-month review, which happened and was concluded in June 2021. In between those two key 12-month reviews, there has been quite a lot of activity by FATF. There's some useful reports on red flag indicators. They also consulted on the revised guidance. So the guidance that was published in June 19 underwent a consultation period. And only recently, in October 2021, they adopted revised guidance. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail next. And before I do so, 12-month reviews, just to give a bit more of an insight in terms of this 12-month review process. As I said, the first 12-month review was concluded by June 2020, and it was assessing countries' progress in adopting these revised standards. There was a second 12-month review that concluded in June of this year, and they did acknowledge that there has been significant progress by the public sector. So the number of jurisdictions which had implemented regimes to regulate virtual asset service providers increased from 33 to 58. Which is significant progress, although you would like that number to be closer to 200 potential jurisdictions. which are implementing regulatory frameworks for virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, meaning there's still a gap. The FATF have acknowledged that it's still not enough. We need to see the majority of jurisdictions, or ideally all jurisdictions, implementing regulatory frameworks to bring these virtual asset service providers to the same standards as you would expect other in scope money laundering, terrorist financing regulated entities to be subject to. There's also been particular delays in implementation of the travel rule. So the travel rule is a specific standard that requires virtual asset service providers to exchange certain information about originators and beneficiaries of transactions. There's been quite, or at least jurisdictions have not made significant progress in implementing and legislating for the travel rule. So this is a graphic that was released last 12-month review. As you can see, the progress being made when it comes to implementing recommendation 15, which is the recommendation that covers virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, it has been quite mixed, depending on whether they are direct members or parts of the regional bodies. But very interestingly enough, you can see a blue underneath the chart, which is compliant. So no single reviewed country was fully compliant in recommendation 15, which is quite worrying. So we are still seeing that countries that have been assessed against these new standards are still not fully complying with the updated standards. Okay, so I'm just going to give some quick insights on the updated guidance. So as I said, the FATF updated the initial guidance that they issued. The guidance was updated in the past couple of months. And even though there haven't been significant changes in terms of the policy position that the FATF is taking, they have really clarified a lot of the guidance, and they've expanded on certain areas where they felt countries were either misinterpreting or not fully understanding the policy objectives that they seek to achieve through this guidance. So the first one was the definition of what a virtual asset service provider is. Just to clarify that they expect the definition to be interpreted expansively. Further highlighting risks with regards to peer-to-peer transactions, clarifying some standards in terms of the implementation of the travel rule, clarifying certain risks and expectations with regards to stablecoins, and some further guidance on DeFi, on decentralized finance. So when it comes to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, some of you might be familiar with the definitions, but a virtual asset is a digital representation of value that can be digitally traded or transferred and can be used for payments or investment purposes. They do not include digital representations of fiat currencies, securities, or other assets already covered in the recommendations. So if you have a digital form of value that can be traded or transferred, providing it's not already covered somewhere else, this asset would be considered a virtual asset. And entities that are providing services related to virtual asset, and those services are also defined in the guidance, would be considered virtual asset service providers. So there's 5 defined activities, including the exchange of virtual assets for other virtual assets, custody, transfer, financial services related to issuance of assets. If you are performing these services regarding virtual assets, then you should be regulated as a virtual asset service provider. And one of the key changes from the initial guidance to the updated guidance is that they feel that these definitions need to be interpreted extremely broadly. So there are quite a number of participants in the crypto asset industry which argue that they may not be performing VASP services or VASP activities, particularly in the DeFi space. The FATF really are mandating for this broad interpretation to ensure that entities that are performing these services, even loosely, should be considered to be VASPs. So peer-to-peer transactions, really they're highlighting the enhanced risk So as the regulatory focus has been shifting to businesses, centralized exchanges and custodians, for example, that are interacting with virtual assets, we do have this risk that the use of peer-to-peer transactions and hosted wallets increases, and that's where there's less grip from a regulatory perspective. So they have highlighted some key, mainly risk factors to be considered with peer-to-peer transactions, although they do acknowledge that there are advantages of facilitating and allowing these transactions when it comes to financial inclusion, which is very positive. On the travel rule, not many changes, to be honest, but they have really clarified what is expected in travel rule compliance. So they have clarified certain elements when it comes to the transfer of data regarding the travel rule. They use the words immediately and securely. So that's something that you need to bear in mind, so that the value transfer along with the information to be exchanged when complying with the travel rule needs to travel at the same time effectively. They also bring in this concept of counterparty VASP due diligence. So we are looking at some sort of correspondent banking counterpart due diligence, but for VASPs effectively. So that's quite interesting as well. On the stablecoin side, again, really just clarifying which entities they would consider to be VASPs in the stablecoin arrangement, which is very interesting. Long story short, most of the governance bodies participating in stablecoins should be considered to be VASPs. And last but not least, DeFi. So the FATF do acknowledge that an application cannot be a VASP, because an application, a smart contract, for example, is not a business. But many entities that are involved in the DeFi space are likely to be considered to be VASPs under this expansive definition in the guidance. So they do mention that decentralized projects that do not interact with VASPs are unlikely. So it's likely that in every DeFi arrangement, there will be at least one VASP involved. So they do bring in this concept of sufficient influence and control, which is something that would be very difficult for countries to legislate for. But that's largely the test that they're looking at as to whether you're a VASP or not. And a few other factors, such as if you're collecting fees directly or indirectly, are large factors to whether a company should be considered a VASP under the FATF guidance. Okay, so where are we heading? I think we have seen significant progress, particularly with regards to money laundering and terrorist financing standards. Globally, we've seen a number of jurisdictions implementing regulatory frameworks and regimes regarding AML-CFT. And I believe that trend will continue, given that there is this pressure from the FATF for countries to implement their standards. We will see countries implementing the travel rule further, and not only legislating for the travel rule, but we will see more enforcement of the travel rule as solution providers emerge, and as we have more uniform playing fields regarding the travel rule and crypto regulation globally. And I also feel that these past few years, countries have kind of been playing catch up with regards to these standards. Countries have been implementing regulatory frameworks, but I feel that the sort of supervisory side of this regulation probably hasn't been up to speed as countries are getting used to implementing standards for crypto asset businesses and virtual asset service providers. So I do feel that there will be more of a regulatory pressure as focus switches to supervision from countries and from competent authorities. DeFi as well, I feel we'd see be further brought under the spotlight as the centralized players become tamed. You will see more of these decentralized players trying to benefit from regulatory arbitrage and abuse the systems. And then finally, I think there is a large focus on money laundering and terrorist financing standards, but I think we also will start to see risks being addressed from other elements of crypto assets and virtual assets. So I believe that there will be a bigger focus on things like consumer protection, security standards for VASPs, for example, when it comes to custody, prudential requirements. These are largely areas of regulation that have not been fully explored because the focus has been mainly on money laundering and terrorist financing. So thank you very much for having me. I hope that really sets the scene for some of the other discussions that we'll be having further on today.
Nathan, thank you so much for your presentation. Absolutely interesting. We also received a lot of questions on Slido. Maybe we can share some of them with you. I'm just going to reply myself to the first one, which is about sharing presentations. And yes, we're going to share presentations and videos taken from this conference on our YouTube Basel Institute on Governance channel, but also check our landing page for the conference where videos and links will be shared. Now you can maybe have a couple of questions.
Yeah, happy to. So I mean,
just have a couple of minutes. I just want to remind you that.
Okay. Yes, the question at the top, I think, is probably worth leaving to one of the blockchain analytics companies who do a lot more in-depth analysis on this kind of stuff. So I mean, in terms of dealing with VASPs, the question in the middle, where you are interacting with VASPs in jurisdictions that are unlikely to offer assistance, I think it depends what perspective we are looking at this question from. If you are a private sector entity that is interacting with VASPs, I think you need to take a risk-based approach in terms of which VASP you want to deal with. When it comes to law enforcement, I think it is a challenge right now. As I said, we are in this sort of stage globally where certain jurisdictions have implemented frameworks regarding VASPs, but the particular jurisdiction that you are dealing with might not have. So it is really a case of attempting to contact those jurisdictions through the regular avenues. Even though not all jurisdictions have implemented regulatory frameworks regarding virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, most jurisdictions still have frameworks in place with regards to money laundering, terrorist financing, and if you can establish a link, you could potentially still receive assistance through the appropriate channels, irrespective of whether they're regulated or not.
Okay, Nathan, thank you so much for your presentation and for replying to a couple of questions.
Thank you for having me.
I look forward to see you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.